All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really radical framework that fundamentally redefines how we look at our entire global economic system. We're going to be diving into the groundbreaking work of critical theorist Nancy Fraser. She essentially argues that the way we typically understand the economy, well, it's really only half the story. The other half is a fascinating, yet pretty sobering concept that she calls cannibal capitalism. To map out exactly where we're headed today, we're going to quickly cover the capitalist front story, systemic parasitism explained, the four devoured pillars, a real-world case study on DRC cobalt, critiques of the framework, and finally, transformative justice and redomaining.
Okay, let's jump right into part one, the capitalist front story, or basically, the textbook definition of our economy.
So, when most of us picture capitalism, we traditionally view it through a Marxist lens, right? An economic system defined by private property, market exchange, and the exploitation of wage labor. Fraser actually calls this the front story. It's what happens on the main stage. But her entire argument is that to even exist, this front story is completely 100% dependent on a massive hidden backstory. And that backstory is the relentless expropriation of non-economic background conditions. Essentially, her framework says you simply cannot have that traditional economic front stage without systematically taking things from the backstage.
That brings us right to part two, systemic parasitism explained. These are the hidden conditions of possibility.
Now, this right here is the absolute core of Fraser's entire theory. The crucial point is this idea of systemic parasitism. In her framework, the capitalist economy is what she calls constitutively dependent on these non-economic background conditions. It literally needs them to survive. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. It systematically fails to replenish or repair them. It treats these foundational systems like an endless all-you-can-eat buffet, basically devouring its own non-economic foundations to keep itself going. It acts as a structural parasite. So the foreground features of capitalism rely incredibly heavily on an ongoing, unofficial mechanism of theft. The framework calls this the expropriation-exploitation nexus. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it means the profitable exploitation of traditional, paid-wage workers is only made possible by the literal expropriation of wealth, energy, and resources from outside the formal market. It's taking without paying, plain and simple.
So what exactly is being devoured? Let's move to part three. The four devoured pillars, which are care, nature, state, and race.
The first devoured pillar is gendered social reproduction. Think about the unpaid care work happening right now in your own home or your community. Raising children, cooking, cleaning, maintaining households. This is the invisible labor that actually creates and sustains the human beings that capital desperately needs for its workforce. Yet, the formal economy assigns this work virtually zero monetized value. It devours the energy and time of caregivers without providing the resources to actually replenish them.
The second pillar is the ecological environment. The system treats nature as this infinite, totally costless input for raw materials and energy, and at the exact same time treats it as a free trash can to absorb all of its waste and carbon emissions. It just free rides on the Earth's capacity to restore itself. And because the drive for profit ignores ecological limits, it pushes our ecosystems right to the brink of crisis.
Pillar number 3 is public power and the state. Now, the capitalist economy is deeply indebted to legal systems, infrastructures, and the public forces needed to maintain private property and manage systemic crises, right? But here is the massive irony. Capital constantly tries to defund the state. It works to evade the exact taxes and regulations that are necessary to sustain the very public goods it relies on to function.
And the fourth pillar is racialized expropriation. Fraser's framework argues that capital continually confiscates wealth, land, and human capacities from vulnerable, dependent populations, very often in the global south or from marginalized domestic communities. By denying these populations full political protection, the system secures an ongoing stream of free or incredibly cheap inputs to keep the global system profitable for the core.
Okay, let's look at part 4. Case study DRC cobalt. This is where we ground the theory in empirical reality.
Empirical research on artisanal cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo maps out this dual devouring of human health and local ecosystems almost perfectly. As our global demand for clean energy batteries absolutely skyrockets, we see the stark, on-the-ground reality of systemic parasitism. You have workers facing toxic chemical exposure for meager wages happening right alongside severe environmental expropriation, things like massive deforestation and the contamination of local water supplies with sulfuric acid. However, Researchers analyzing the DRC make a very important point. We shouldn't just view these marginalized communities as passive victims of a parasitic system. Empirical evidence clearly shows they actively resist. They develop informal safety practices, they create strong mutual aid networks, and they form community-led cooperative movements. So even within incredibly constrained circumstances, there's real agency, resilience, and a drive to protect their communities against this systemic extraction.
Moving on to Part 5, Critiques of the Framework. Let's look at the pushback against cannibal capitalism.
Because this framework touches on highly complex and debated themes, we need to impartially examine the pushback. This brings us to a major point of debate among academics. Does capitalism structurally require racism, as Fraser argues with her fourth pillar, or is its core logic purely about class-based domination?
So critics from more traditional Marxist circles contend that capitalism is fundamentally anti-human rather than inherently racist. They argue its core logic is class-based exploitation, and that extends to anyone caught within its web regardless of identity. Furthermore, academic reviews of Fraser's work point out that the precise dividing line between the exploitation of the waged worker and the brute expropriation of the dependent subject, well, it's blurring into a very confusing continuum, especially since so many modern workers face extreme precarity and massive debt today.
Finally, Part 6, Transformative Justice and Redomaining. Let's look at Fraser's proposed solutions.
So how do we fix a system that is literally eating itself? Fraser argues for transformative justice. And for her, this means we absolutely have to move beyond just redistributing wealth at the end of the day. We have to fundamentally rethink how resources are governed from the ground up through a process she calls redomaining. Basically, this means moving these vital background conditions, our care networks, our nature, our public power, completely out of capital's parasitic reach. The ultimate goal here is an institutionalized society that actually replenishes, repairs, and replaces all the wealth that it uses up.
Ultimately, this framework forces us to synthesize our understanding of the world. Why does this matter to you? Because it means we can no longer view the economy in a vacuum. Ecology, care work, state power, and racialized inequalities are inextricably tied to any future economic transformation we might hope for. It really broadens what counts as resistance. It shows us that fighting for the environment, or fighting for better social care, is fundamentally fighting the exact same underlying system.
I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought. As our global demand for technology, energy, and resources continues to skyrocket, can our finite Earth and our human societies truly survive an institutionalized system that is hardwired for infinite extraction?